This is the Actual Fluency Podcast, helping you become a better language learner by providing motivating weekly inspiration, as well as top tips and tricks from expert guests. And now, your host, Chris Broholm.
Hey everyone, I'm so happy to be back with the Actual Fluency Podcast. I know it's been a couple of months off the air, and I have to apologize for that, but I had some things going on in my life, as some of you have heard, especially if you're part of the email club, where I send out weekly emails about what's going on Actual Fluency and in my language learning. So for those who don't know, I was in Hungary, living there for about a year and a half, learning Hungarian and just living there like living in any other country. And by the end of it, I had gone to Canada for a month for the Montreal Language Festival. And when I came back to Hungary, I didn't really find a suitable living arrangement, so I had to live in quite a terrible hotel. And that's when I made the decision to actually come back to Denmark to sort out my business, make it a bit more official, get all the paperwork fixed, and become a proper citizen. Because it's not that I don't believe you could do it abroad, it's just so much easier at home, because they know who you are, you have the citizenship already, you're kind of entitled to some kind of assistance and help, not necessarily financially, but something like social security and stuff like that. So I'm back in Denmark, and it's taken me a little while to actually recover from that. I came back at the end of November. I told you on the email that I was going to kind of record some episodes and get ready for a new season in December, and also, of course, holidays. So we're back. It's January, and it's time for new language goals. It's time for new language adventures. A new year has begun. For me, I'm extremely excited to keep going from where I left off last year. I've been working extremely hard. Okay, not extremely hard, you guys know me. But I've been working quite a lot on making Actual Fluency more consistent, more coherent as a brand, and also increasing the income to the point where I can begin to slowly sustain a lifestyle off of it. It's not exactly a full-time income yet, but hopefully I can make that happen soon, so I don't have to worry to death about making ends meet enough to pay for food and rent and stuff like that. So in that breath, I just want to thank you all for supporting the site, and also, just by listening, you're actually supporting the site. And somebody asked me, I forget the name now, why I don't talk more about ways you can support the show. And for me, it's just, I'm not too comfortable asking for support in that way. I'd much rather the people figured it out that, okay, well, is there any way we can support the show if they want to? I don't want to be one of those people who say, oh, unless I get this amount of money every month, I will never make another podcast. No, of course not. If you want to support the show, I do have a Patreon page, and I really appreciate the people who are supporting. Shout out to you guys for being the pillars and the foundation of the inspiration that drives me. Because when I was off the air, I got a lot of emails, a lot of messages asking, is the show gone? What's going on, Chris? Are you okay? Have you died? And I really appreciate that kind of, that you care about me and the show enough to ask me that. So just know that whatever you do, the reason that this show is going is because of you, because you push me to keep going, to keep producing, to perform as well. Because sometimes you might not think of it, but doing interviews well is kind of like performing a music number, or writing a book. It's an art form that sometimes is taken for granted, and I certainly did it myself. And then people told me, oh, you're so good at it. And I'm not sure that's true, but basically it's quite a lot of work, and I appreciate all the support I can get, and especially the encouraging messages. I really appreciate those, because it really shows me that what I'm doing is worthwhile and it's of use to you. Somebody emailed me the other day saying that whenever she felt a little bit demotivated, that's a new word, demotivated, she would listen to another episode, and it would help her get back on track. And there's really no better use for the podcast that I can think of, and there's really no greater gift for me than to be able to help you guys with your language learning goals. And, I don't want to take 20 minutes per episode, but since this is the first episode, this is why the introduction is a little bit longer than usual. But the last thing I just wanted to touch on is the 2017 agenda of Polyglot events, because of course you guys are probably interested in what's going on around the world, and where can I go and practice my languages, where can I go and meet like-minded language learners to basically network with, to make new friendships, to be inspired from, which is why I go to these events. And there are three big main events, and there have been since last year. And of course, the biggest one and the most famous one is the Polyglot Conference, created by Richard Simcott and Alex Rawlings. Last year it was in Thessaloniki, Greece, which was a great time. I think the city for me was a bit of a okay, the food was great, but the city was a little bit run down, and it had a bit of a limited scope of what you can do. There's a bit of history, a few museums, and lots of cafes and stuff. But for me, I think it's probably more of a summer city. I'd like to see what it is like in the summer, assuming it's not too hot, which it probably is, and then I wouldn't like it anyway. But the other two events are the Language Festival in Montreal, which was started last year and was called North American Polyglot Symposium. And I'm really excited they changed the name, because that name was too long and too confusing. And it's coming back, and I really hope I can go. Last year I was lucky enough to go, in part because they asked me to speak there, so some of the travel costs were subsidized, and everything kind of lined up that I was able to go and stay there. But we'll see what happens this year, if I'm able to go or not. Now that Actual Fluency is a registered business in Denmark, I will of course be able to take advantage of that and have some of the costs subsidized there in the taxes instead. But of course it is expensive to go across the pond, and so that's probably the most uncertain one for me. But it's also the one I'd love to go to the most, because I think I really love North America, and Montreal is just such a lovely city with lots of a different culture and lots of experiences. Really, I was really pleased to be there for a whole month, and I didn't even touch the surface of what the city had to offer. So for me, definitely a highlight of the year would be going to the Montreal Language Festival, which is at the end of August. And I forgot to mention that the Polyglot Conference, which changes its location every year, is going to be in Iceland, in Reykjavik, of course. And that's at the end of October, so there should be a good chance of seeing the Northern Lights, and which was obviously going to be super cool. And I hope to make it there also. I would say I'm slightly less excited about Iceland than I am about Canada. But as somebody pointed out recently, I am a bit of a city person. And, if you really like nature, then I'm sure Iceland would be a ridiculous experience. And also because Iceland is kind of connected to Denmark, I am interested in going there. But I must say, if you put a gun to my head and say you could choose between Canada or Iceland, I would probably prefer to go to Canada for this. The final big event, there are of course lots of small events around the year, is the Polyglot Gathering, which has been taking place in Berlin for the last 4 years. And now for the first time, they're going to move it to a different country. They're going to move it to Slovakia, where it's going to be in Bratislava, of course. And they're going to be helped by Lydia Makova, who is going to be on the podcast actually next week. And we talk a little bit about it there. But yeah, those are the three main events. And of course, there are smaller events around the world as well. And if you have any ideas for events, just give me a message and I'll share them here on the podcast. So without all that out of the way, I'm just going to say thank you again for your patience, and thank you for your unwiltering support. And I am really excited to be bringing you this episode and a whole new season for a whole new year, so that we can all learn the languages we dream of and see the places that we want to go to, and just have a great time. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters, really. It's not whether you know 20 or 10 languages or just 5 or 3 like me. It's about having fun, and it's about socializing, and it's about accomplishing what is important to you and not to everyone else. And it's not about some arbitrary number on let's say a conference badge, or how many flags you can put on your chest. That's not what it's about. It's about socializing. It's about culture. It's about getting to know other people. It's about having fun, I think, first and foremost. So with that in mind, please enjoy this episode. and the season. And if you have, as always, if you have any feedback, suggestions, comments, especially people you'd like to hear from, people you'd like me to invite onto the podcast to talk to, please send me an email or a message via the website, or you can send it to chris@actualfluency.com. And I will take a look at it and do my best. So thank you so much, and enjoy the episode. Today I'm happy to welcome Gareth Popkins from howtogetfluent.com. Gareth is one of my good friends, and I've been meeting him at polyglot events around the world, and he's been making some great videos, kind of journaling his own efforts to learn a couple of not so usual languages. So definitely check out howtogetfluent.com after listening to this episode. But for now, let's get into the episode where we talk about the polyglot events, the community itself, and Gareth's experience with learning languages throughout the years. For now, I'd just like to welcome you onto the show and say that it's a great pleasure to finally have I've gotten you here, because we've been talking about doing this for quite a while, and you were a cameo guest. Is that a correct?
In Budapest,
yeah,
that was.
Yes. You were sort of a fleeting guest for a comment or two about the polyglot workshops, which we had a lot of fun with, and ultimately changed my life because I stayed in Budapest, which was unexpected. And it changed your life as well, because you had a great workshop, I know. So, Gareth, why don't you start by telling us a bit about your life? How did you get started in languages? When did that passion come up for the first time?
Well, that's an interesting question, because professionally my life has been that I studied history, I did postgraduate work in history, and then I actually lectured in Russian history. And at university in Wales. And after that, I went to law school and trained as an international lawyer, which is what I do at the moment. But languages have always been there in the mix. When I was very little, before I remember, we had a French au pair live in the house when I was about 2 or 3 years old. And she apparently used to speak to me in French. And my mum always used to ascribe my subsequent enthusiasm for languages to this early influence, even though I didn't at least consciously remember anything of that. The other element early on was awareness of the Welsh heritage on my father's side, so that when we went down sometimes on holiday to Wales from where we lived in Yorkshire in the north of England, it was a completely monoglot English environment I grew up in, I would occasionally hear distant cousins speaking Welsh. I knew also that my father's father had spoken Welsh. I never knew him, but he had spoken Welsh, and although my father grew up in England as an English speaker. So these sort of languages were flying around. I wasn't particularly good at them at school. It's a familiar story, I think. So I just studied French, and I dropped it as quickly as I could when I was 16. But then, funnily enough, I think during my sixth form, so the 2 years before university, when I was 17, 18, I started almost straight away to get interested in languages again. And then I got the language bug. And I think when I was an undergraduate studying history, I was already looking rather wistfully to those who were studying modern languages. I started to work again a lot on my French. I started to teach myself Welsh. And I made sure that I chose doctoral work in an area which meant I would have to and would have a chance to learn languages. And that's how I got into Russian studies. And I went off to live in Germany as well when I was a doctoral student, and in Finland. So I've had a very rich sort of time with languages later on. But it was all really on the hoof and not, beyond French up to age 16, not part of my formal education.
That's interesting you say that, because I hear that a lot, and then once in a while, let's say every 20 interviews or something, people are like, yeah, I was great at languages in school, and it just kind of kept going. But for the vast majority, I think that people are not good at languages in school, and that begs the question, how does this anomaly happen where you're not interested? Because obviously when you're not good at something, you're usually not happy about it either. Like when I was in French as classes in school, I enjoyed it, sort of, but I was very bad at it, which led me to not enjoying it, So what did you have that same experience? Did you enjoy the French classes?
Well, I was quite an academic little kid in my glasses and with my little briefcase, and I sort of did enjoy the studying of it.
Okay.
I was reasonably good at it. I was less good at German. I also did German. I forgot to mention that for 2 years at the ripe age of 12, 13, 14. That I couldn't understand because we weren't taught English grammar, so I couldn't understand what the subject and the object was, and this suddenly becomes much more important in German, of course, with the case endings and the case system. But I don't know what it is. I think for me, I think partly for us as kids in the town where I lived, foreign languages were really almost a theoretical thing. We knew that they existed, but mass culture was Anglo-American. There weren't really people around speaking other languages, apart from, the kid whose parents owned the Chinese takeaway in the town. So I didn't grow up somewhere like in London with many, many languages around. So it was all rather theoretical, which made motivation, I suppose, slightly more difficult for many people. I was lucky that my parents were taking me abroad. We were going to Scandinavia on holidays. We were going to France. We went to the Balkans as well, Yugoslavia as it was then. And I was always fascinated to hear the languages. But it didn't really connect to what was happening in school. And the other thing, I think, simply was, you weren't seeing results.
Right.
When I would then go to France on holiday, I was far too shy to speak. Not only that, but I couldn't, even if I'd been much more confident, there wasn't much I could actually say. And I think that has to go down partly to the teaching methods and the way that languages were taught in school.
It's the rote learning, memorize a lot of stuff, don't actually speak that much, that kind of thing.
Well, the methods weren't that, antique. And I think the teachers understood that, the danger of taking that approach. I think part of the problem is simply the timetabling. I would be a fan, I think, of having a much more intensive burst of language study, even a 6-month block or something for children, and then teaching some subjects perhaps through the target language. So you could do that, but what we were doing was a couple of half-hour sessions a week, or 3, I can't remember, in a class of 20 children perhaps. And it simply is not enough in terms of time. And you're quite right, it wasn't really speaking practice then. And then when we did have assistants coming, young student teachers from France, we were so embarrassed and we couldn't really say very much anyway. So even such practice as we had was entirely insufficient.
Right. And I remember doing the math for my German, which is something I've been doing since grade 5, I think, up through grade 13, 14, whatever the high school equivalent is. And it was something like 300 hours, which even for the easiest languages, by the Foreign Service Institute, they consider that insufficient to reach a proper level. So I'm quite happy with my level after that, after I did the math, because when you say I did German for 8 years, it sounds like you've been doing it for ages, but actually I don't know if it was Benny who said it or someone else I got it from, but somebody said you should count your hours, not your months or your years.
Yes.
And that's so true, isn't it?
Yes, and the amount of time investment isn't really the problem with languages. I think people can get clear and you can wise people up to the fact that it does take many hundreds of hours to learn a language. The problem is then that, people, once people have understood that, then you need to make that time happen in an effective way. And I do think often, obviously it's not always practical, but a more intense period of learning and speaking the language is better.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, because I know that's one of your MOs, as they say. But let's just bridge the gap between after your university degrees and how did that period look? Did you go to Russia by then to work?
Yes.
Or...
Yeah. No, I was by the time as I say, as an undergraduate doing my first degree. I had already become very interested again in French. We had to do a French exam actually as part of the entrance procedure to get into the university, and so my French was back on the boil. And in the final year, I specialised in French history, among other things. I also started as a first-year undergraduate to teach myself Welsh. I did a summer school in Welsh, and then. When I graduated from university, then I put that aside for the second half of my studies to focus on the history. And then I took what was called then a year out, what is now known as a gap year in England. at least. And I went to Wales and I focused entirely on learning Welsh. I did an intensive summer course, and then I lived with a Welsh family in West Wales, in Aberystwyth, and got fluent in my ancestral language, if you like. And that was a great experience. That was the first time that I felt that I got the buzz of actually being able to speak a foreign language. And during that time too, that year, I was applying to go back to Oxford, which was my university, to register in a Russian history, for Russian history postgraduate work, which would become my what they call a DPhil, a PhD, doctorate in Russian history. And I did that in a full knowledge I was going to have to learn Russian, at least read Russian very quickly. And so I was doing that on the side as well during the second half of my time in Wales. So it was all a bit chaotic. And I arrived back in Oxford. I had a couple of very inspiring advisors to the professors there who were very enthusiastic linguists and helped me and really encouraged me. And I started German as well. And then I was able to almost, if you like, play the system in that I managed to use the Erasmus scheme to get 8 months in Freiburg in Germany. And because where I was then, I was using printed sources at that stage. It didn't really matter where I was sitting. So that scheme enabled me to register as a postgrad in Freiburg without having to do the language exam, because my German wouldn't have been good enough for that. And I spent 8 months there and got really quite fluent in German by the end. And then at the end of that, I went off to Russia for a year, and that was my main archival year. And that was an exciting year. That was actually the year just after the coup back in 1991. It's a long time ago now. And the Soviet Union ceased to exist while I was there, in effect, at the end of 1991. Ukraine became independent. There were price reforms. It's a very exciting time, quite a stressful time for Russians, but also a time of opening up and what now looks like very naive optimism about the future on both sides, I think. So I had a wonderful year there doing the archival research and living in the Russian Hall of Residence, hanging out with young people. So that's how it went. And then the following year, I went to Finland. I got another scholarship to go to Finland. This was to continue my doctoral work, to process all the archival material using the brilliant Slavic library, which is part of Helsinki University. So that's when I started dabbling in a little Finnish. And in the meantime, then, luckily for me, one of my supervisors had left Oxford and become professor in Heidelberg. So I went back this was now in 93. He said, you can come. By this stage, the money was running out. I'd sort of exhausted the grant system, and I still wasn't finished with my research, and I was writing it up. And he said, you can come and work for me as a research assistant in Germany. So like a shot, I went back to Germany. This time I took the language exam and properly matriculated in Heidelberg. And I lived there for 2.5 years, finishing the thesis. He had a job for me for a year. It was a part-time job, which I did. I also started teaching English. I worked as a waiter. And I was generally becoming financially quite self-sufficient. And then as I was finishing the thesis, I was quite lucky again in the timing that I managed to get a post as what's called a lecturer in the British system, an assistant professor in the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, teaching Russian history, European history through the medium of Welsh.
Wow!
So I then spent the next 5 years up to the new millennium, as we can say, doing that. So I had a fantastic time really when I was able to take my French forward, learn Welsh, and then Russian and German, living in those countries. I had some time in Finland. I was dabbling a little in other languages too, and progressing my history career at the same time.
Well, that's incredible, and I think that serves as a quite a valuable, if not lesson, then at least a very useful tip to kind of make your learning relevant to your life. Make it a part of your life, not just some kind of side thing that you do on the side.
Yes. For me, it was something I planned in. That I could also with enthusiasm have done research in English history, which interests me greatly, But the languages, if you study a foreign country which is not English speaking, then the languages are part of that picture. And I was really lusting to go abroad, to live abroad. It was pre-internet, so it was more necessary, I think, than it is now, actually, speaking to, fellow language learners. Of course, now you can do wonderful things on Skype. You can access audio very easily. That's another thing. When I went to Wales in the end of my first year to do my first summer school in Welsh when I was just starting, I took with me my little transistor radio, which didn't have FM on it, because then the broadcasts were mainly on the AM, on what we called medium wave and long wave. And the Welsh radio station was broadcast on FM, so I couldn't pick it up. So it was a terrible disappointment to me, because in the evening after the lessons, I wanted to listen to Welsh radio and so on. This is just unimaginable today, these sort of hassles. Yeah. So going abroad was more important then. Although one of the things that struck me when I arrived in Russia was the number of older people who had never had the opportunity there to travel, who'd managed nevertheless to get to a very good level of English. So even without the technology, you always had the shortwave radio and so on. You could pick up the sound of a language, but certainly the internet makes it a lot easier.
Do you think that the fact that you didn't have the internet back then made you more likely to actually go out and practice with people and actually interact with people? Whereas if, let's say, somebody went to Russia today, they might be very protected by the expat bubble, which has arisen. You've got all the meetup groups, you've got your Skype, you've got your Facebook. You can always live your life completely independent of the local language. Do you think there's a change there, or did you feel like you just had a more outgoing personality enough to go on and actually use it, which is the key, I guess, to actually using that year to something productive?
I don't think it's decisive in that sense. I think that there have always been expat bubbles. You only have to look at life in the British Raj in India or something like that. So I think the internet is a good tool, I think, for introverts who want to make contact. Some people prefer sort of the Skype type format. Not everybody. But I think in the end, it's about the choices you make, about the kind of contact you want. Whether you're introvert or extrovert, particularly when you're in the country, who are you going to get to know? Are you going to make that extra effort? And it's uncomfortable at the beginning to interact in a new language when you can't speak very much. Or are you going to retreat into a bubble? And again, you've got to plan carefully who you're hanging out with, and do that early as well, so that you don't get new friends who are English speaking, because then it's rather awkward if you're not going to ditch your friends because of language. So it's better at the beginning to meet people who you can speak with in your target language. But I don't think the technology really. I think, no, not in terms of the expat bubble or in terms of likeliness to speak. It was in other ways that technology has changed things. I think getting access to the language when you're beginning before you're in the country, or if you don't go to the country.
Right.
And obviously keeping in touch with the folks at home as well is much easier now, which makes it less of a wrench, really, less of a break to go and live abroad, and easier.
Yeah, that's a good tip that you said, that it's, if you know that you're going to Russia, which I hope that people know if they're going. It would be funny if they were just abducted one day. But learn a little bit from home at least, because I know this from personal experience, and I've heard other people talk about it. If you land in the country knowing absolutely nothing, you're not going to magically learn the language in 6 months or 3 months or a year, or whatever your deadline is. And if you do a little bit of homework, and it's really minimal, really, you just need the basics of formality and just questions, I think you really speed up your learning a lot. Like my Hungarian, for instance, I was there for 18 months or something like that. I think I spent the first year just doing very little work, and if I did some work, it was really slow because I didn't have anything from home, so I didn't know the first thing, and I wasted a lot of time kind of learning the basics, and not learning the basics, which I think once you're a little bit nervous about, oh, I've been here 6 months already and I don't know anything, it gets harder and harder to actually get going. But
yes,
do a little bit from home.
Yeah, I think yeah, there are two ways you can look at that. I think yes, everybody should be, those of us who are language lovers, it should be learning some basic phrase book type language. You can make even just a little card with some basic key questions such as how do you say this in Mauritanian or whatever, and could you speak more slowly please, and where you're from, where my name is, and all this, what is that, that sort of thing. There's that which can be done very quickly, almost on the plane, as it were. But then there's also, if you're going for a longer period with the intention of working on the language, there is an argument for getting up through the elementary level almost to the sort of what's called the A2 level, of course, on the European common frame of reference, to the border with the intermediate B levels, so that you really do hit the ground running.
That would be perfect,
Yes, of course, that's not always, that's sometimes a lot easier said than done. When you relocate to a new country, unless you're going on a corporate package, as I was when I went back to Russia later on, we'll maybe get onto that as a lawyer 10 years after my first experience, or you're going, of course, as a student when everything is looked after for you, you've got a lot of hassle. You've got the bureaucracy. You must have experienced this in Budapest. You've got to find accommodation. And these are actually all wonderful learning opportunities, frustrating as they will be at the time when things go wrong, you can't get the internet and so on. But if you've got enough language actually to be having all these experiences in the target language, that is a wonderful thing, and that language is going to stick, and it's language that you really need. But to do that, obviously you've got to be at more than the phrasebook level when you arrive, because nobody feels confident about signing a lease, or paying over money when they don't understand what's going on. I mean,
right?
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would definitely say the better you can be, the better your experience will be for the language. I just think that it's hard for people usually to reach something like A2 in most languages anyway. Most people, maybe it's just me who I might be a bit what do you call it? I don't plan well, so maybe that's because I didn't know I was going to Hungary, for instance. So it's very limited what I could do. But if I had done just the minimum, I could have gotten some success experiences that would perhaps motivate me more in the beginning, when you're also dealing with all the, I'm in a different country, I don't understand anything, and it's a different culture, I need to find somewhere to live, I need to organize this, and this, and I need to buy that, and where's the adapter, and so I think it's a great advice, and I mean, you've clearly taken to that with most, if not all, of your languages to actually go and live in the country. Have you tried learning a language, or been learning a language where you didn't go for a period of time to the local?
I think knowing about the country and seeing a language in context is very, very important. As I say, it's much easier now to get a sense of the languages in its environment because of the internet. But the languages, the main language I'm working at now is the Basque language. And I had been to the Basque country several times for other reasons, mainly to do with also the language revival movement through connections and friends in Wales, but not actually to learn Basque. I took part in what's called the Corica, which is a mass-sponsored run for the language, which is held in the Basque country every 2 years. So I decided to see the country, thought it was a cool place, interesting, linguistically fascinating, because that language is not related to any other, it's an isolate. So I'd been on several short trips, I'd had my appetite whetted, and then I started to learn on my own, using Skype, using all the sort of methods that you'd be familiar with, working with the textbook, working with the teacher, setting goals, accountability, everything I could. But then last summer I did an intensive 1 month's course, which was an attempt to replicate, if you like, going to live in the country, but for a shorter period. Still a long period, of course. Most people can't take a month. But that was, to go and do a course, so not just turning up in the country, which is more or less what happened for me in Germany and in Russia. And I have also just done a course. I've just been to Indonesia for the first time. I've done a 1 week course in Indonesian, which is much closer to what you're talking about. The Facebook. There's not much you can do in a week, in a way, but in a way there is a lot you can do in a week.
Oh yeah,
because then now coming back to that, I've been back about 3 weeks, had a lot of stuff on here, but now I'm starting to reschedule some lessons in Indonesian online, going back to the books, and I realise I've got quite a good base in that I've got memories of trying to use the language, of the places and events that took place, and of the visual sort of signage and so on. And I think that really does help motivationally. So I'd almost say go early to the country, not expecting much linguistically, perhaps. Book a holiday there, something for a week, and then when you've already decided you're going to learn, and then later on you can do some more study at home, try and fit it into your daily life, and then go back again if you can to do a 2-week course even. Or for longer if you have the time,
right?
When you're moving up the scale.
It's cool, and a lot of people don't like language courses. Maybe they have a bit of a stigma for being bad or inefficient or expensive. But in your experience, they've been very helpful. I can.
Yes, yeah. Well, I had done several a long time ago. As I say, I did the Welsh course, which was I did a 3-week Welsh course, and then during my gap year, I did an 8-week Welsh course. At the end of that year, I also did a 3-week course in France, in Grenoble, in the university. And then I did, when I moved back to Germany for the second time, after my professor had moved over to Heidelberg, then I got a grant from the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, to do 2 months at the Goethe Institute. So I did an intermediate level German course there. I was worried that, 20 years on, I wouldn't be able to hack it in class because I was used to much more independent study. I thought I would find it too boring and too structured. But actually, I found in the Basque Country, although it was quite a structured course and quite traditional in its approach, I had to be there. And the very fact that you have to be there can sometimes help. You tune in, sometimes you're too tired, but it's being thrown at you and some of it sticks. So I don't think group lessons are necessarily the most effective way of learning, but I think they can be useful as part of a portfolio of tools that you have. I also I have been doing weekly night classes in Basque in London. Again, they're not particularly efficient because I'm tired after work, but they're good for the social side almost, which is also important, building my social life with the community here, because there are wider social events connected with them, talking practice, meals and so on. And you are hearing other voices, not just my online teachers. You're hearing explanations. Even the usual objection to lessons are you're held back by the slowest person, if that's not you, which of course, it's sometimes useful to hear things explained that you thought you knew, because maybe actually that will reinforce, or actually, it wasn't quite how I thought it was after all. So I do think language, they have a role. The key thing is always, I think everybody says this, don't they? Quite rightly so, that you mustn't expect, the teacher can't learn for you.
Right.
So the teachers can make a big difference, but at the end of the day, you must not abdicate your own responsibility. And you've got to make sure that you're actually not marginalized in the class, that you're speaking, that you're asking questions as well. That's a good way to sort of intervene politely, respecting the balance of the chemistry of the group.
Sure.
But so I think probably in the Basque Country, we're doing 6 hours a day. I did it for a month. If I go again, I would only, I think, go for 2 weeks, because
did you do 6 hours a day for every work day?
Yes, and we did 5 hours on a Saturday, so it was quite hardcore.
It's really intense.
It's really intense. Yes, I think that that I do enjoy studying on my own too, and I think that is also can be extremely efficient. So I think the balance wasn't quite right for me, but for that time, it was a good thing. And certainly my Basque is a lot better now than it was when I went.
Right. And I think my biggest problem with language courses and things like that, it's not really related to the efficiency or the enjoyment necessarily. It's simply, I think I hear a lot from people who might not have read, Benny's book or our blogs or seen our videos or haven't been to a polyglot event. And they ask me like, I really want to learn French. How should I do it? And the first suggestion is I'll just join a night class or an evening class or whatever. And they kind of expect somehow, I don't know where this comes from, but they seem to expect that they can just show up 2 hours a week or 4 hours a week, maybe on 2 different nights, and that will just teach them the language without any real effort. It seems like they expect it to be transferred somehow. And that's kind of my biggest gripe with it, is when people expect it to be a sole way of learning a language, because I don't think anyone has ever learned a language exclusively with an evening class. That would surprise me.
Yes, and yes, you can't just open the top of somebody's head and pour the language in. You can't buy a language,
That's a good one.
In terms of time speaking.
That's a good one.
In that level of investment, you can. But that's it. It goes back to what we were saying about the amount of time you study at school. Not nearly enough. If you've got a 2-hour evening class or a 1-hour evening class, then that is not intensive enough. Even if it worked, it would take you years to get to the requisite number of hours.
Yeah.
Many hundreds for what they say, about 300 for the languages closest to English for minimal fluency, but it's 1,000, 1,500 hours for some languages like Chinese or Arabic. So depending on how distant a language is from your native tongue, and so people need to get real, I think. That go to that language class. But you're going to need to supplement that with 2 or 3 half-hour Skype sessions, language exchanges a week, with exposure to the language, listening to media, simplified text, perhaps, so that you're not overwhelmed at first, and not just passively, but trying to note things down, snippets that you can understand, trying to repeat them, talk about them. Everything you have to make as interactive as possible, because you need to be producing a language, don't you? And that's hard. It hurts. It makes you feel stupid. It's slow, and you have to do a lot of it. But with the right, it can also be a lot of fun, because you can feel a lot of progress if you're working effectively. Actually, early on, you do make quite a steep early progress.
Enjoy that, because that's not going to last.
No. What you're trying to do is, hey, I don't care if I make mistakes. I just want, I'm communicating in some sort of Basque, some sort of pidgin Basque for me. Later on, of course, then you're hard on yourself because you are making those mistakes. But initially, you just want to get off the ground. It's a sort of the space rocket analogy, and that takes a lot of fuel.
It can be fun to make mistakes.
Yes, it can.
If you can put
you
aside your pride.
You see it that way. Yeah, you have to interpret it that way and not take it to heart, and just keep plowing through. Just keep plowing through.
I think it helps if you just kind of, see the fun side of it, because if you walk into a shop and you try to order something, but it sounds like you want to murder something, or those funny stories. I think laughing at yourself is really helpful in that stage. Because otherwise you might just get really beat down that, she didn't understand me again, and that's a surefire way to lose the motivation ultimately.
Yeah, so you have to work. If you're a rather shy or self-critical person, you have to work on overcoming that, I think, and just trying to change the way you're interpreting what's happening in ways that are going to help you and not to be discouraged. And sometimes that does mean just hanging out with different people, but it may mean there's also cultural knowledge, of course, that you can acquire, which can make interactions more effective.
Right.
Sort of intercultural communication understanding that it's not just the words, but there are there's different body language in different languages, the different use of politeness, even different intonation. Yeah, I mean, for example, for English people, German often sounds very direct because the intonation can be slightly different. And requests in German can often sound a bit like commands to us. And you need to be aware of that, and that it's not that the person is, being impolite towards you. It's just a different way of interacting. Some rhetorics in some countries are much more direct than in others. And if you could self-consciously, you still forget it in the heat of the moment, but sometimes you don't, and that does help. So
yeah, and that's also a plus point for actually being in the language, because it's very unlikely that language books are going to talk about body language, or they talk about the polite version of the words and the endings, but they generally don't talk about what do people actually say to each other. It's more of a kind of a bookish form of the language. So it's another, I guess, tip for just being in the country will help you see the cultural differences. And for many languages, they still have the polite forms, and as you know, it's a very different experience. Like in Russia, it's very established. In Denmark, it's all but dead. In Germany, it's sort of hit and miss, I guess. Most people would prefer the polite form, but some are also like, why did you call me the polite? I'm not that old,
Yes.
So it can be tricky to find the balance, which I think a book cannot explain you, because even the Danish books, if you have let's say a colloquial Danish book from the maybe as late as the 90s, it will still recommend that you use the polite form with most people. And I just think that's nonsense, because nobody does that here. So if you start a polite conversation, people are just going to look at you weirdly. Like, who are you? Where are you from?
Yes.
And then speak back in English, of course, which is a whole different topic. But I wanted to go over to another helping topic, or another source of motivation for some people, and that is the polyglot community. And first of all, I wanted to just tell me, what do you define the polyglot community as?
Well, I suppose when somebody writes the history of the polyglot community, I mean, they will talk about, it's something which existed before the internet. I have just been, as you have, Chris, to the polyglot conference in Greece, and there was a lady there who had been a Greek professor who had been at polyglot competitions in the 1970s, I think, or 80s, she was talking about before the internet. But I think as we understand it now, it is something which has grown out of the internet. And with, the advent of people showing off their language skills, which is great on YouTube, but also blogging about language learning, making materials available, and then being fortunate enough to, for those who have the opportunity to actually meet up in person. And I think for me, it's been a great example of the way that being online can actually lead to great friendships and contacts in the real world. It's not an either or. We shouldn't be, people can't interrelate anymore because they're on the internet all the time. It's not. It's another tool to actually making living connections with people. In terms of the actual name polyglot, I think it's unfortunate because to me that word always is going to mean somebody who can speak a lot of languages. And whereas actually the events that I have attended, that you have attended, regular listeners will know about, with polyglot in the name, are, say, the Gathering in Berlin, this large annual meetup in the spring, several hundred people, and a similar one, the Polyglot Conference, which has been held in different places over the last 3 or 4 years. They're for language enthusiasts, really. So I tend to, and that's how I describe myself, that I'm not particularly, I don't have some gift for languages. I'm not particularly good. I'm just enthusiastic about languages, and that's sufficient, which isn't to say there aren't people, and many of us are not, have not studied linguistics. We don't work as translators or linguists, It's really for enthusiasts of all hues, really, to get together and to talk.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful description. I would add that I would I would. This is probably more what I would love to see. I would love to see people hearing about these events and actually going without speaking that many languages, because obviously the people going either speak a lot of languages or have committed sort of a life path of learning a lot of languages at the moment. I would love for it to broaden out and actually include people who are like, like a bit similar to your story, where they say, well, my dad's dad was a Welsh speaker. I would love to learn Welsh really well, but I don't really know how to do it or where to begin. And I'd love to get that kind of angle included as well, because I think that can really inspire people to start. I don't necessarily want to inspire people to learn 20 languages. I don't think that's a very realistic goal for most people. But if we can get culture of speaking together, opening up, a bit like Richard Benton have been talking about. I don't know if you remember him from
Yes,
New
I do
York.
very much. Yes.
He's obviously a very charitable polyglot, but I think his message is just wonderful. With try, instead of expecting refugees to learn your language right away, why don't you learn a couple of sentences in Somali or Arabic or whatever is required? And I'd love to see more intercultural relationships built that way. But obviously your description was spot on.
Yeah, I mean, another dimension is that, in a sense, polyglot, something you said there made me think again. Polyglot is the right description in the sense that those of us who go are people who love learning languages, and we have to almost restrain ourselves from starting too many languages. The shiny new ball syndrome. So there is a place for that. So in that sense, a polyglot or aspiring polyglot is the correct, actually.
I use that a lot,
description. Yeah. And we are willing to travel to these places to meet all these people because we get a buzz from that. That is maybe a bit different from the person who's decided they want to learn one language, in a sense. And there should be ways, and there are ways using the internet, or that they can find out about good methods, and that they can find groups through Meetup or whatever, or on Facebook, that they can find classes. You don't need to hop around the world in the way there's been happening in polyglot events to do that. And the other thing is, as you say, talking about Richard's message, Richard Benton, that there are an awful, for many of us, lot of languages around us. I live in Brixton in South London. Here there are many Portuguese speakers, and a host of other languages, of course. There were also Eritreans, Somalis around as well. That's Richard's languages in the States. And so as he says, if you don't have an opportunity to travel, this should in no way restrict your language learning.
Look around.
Horizons.
Look around. There's a lot around you. But what made you decide? You were at the first polyglot conference in Budapest, right?
No, I didn't.
You didn't go to the first one.
No.
So your first one was the Novi Sad one.
That's right. I only found out about the Budapest one too late, actually, and it had already been all fixed up, and I think I already had some other commitment at that time. So.
And I have another word for somebody like yourself, and I think you're a bit of the poster boy for my imagination of the word, and that is the polyglot circuit. I think that you and I are part of the circuit where we kind of, or you could also almost call it circuits as well, I guess, a traveling circus, but let's call it circuit for politeness. What made you, because going to one event in Novi Sad, let's say in Europe, which is quite close to England, is a whole different thing than going to, I mean, now you've been to Greece, New York, Serbia. What else? You went to the workshops in
yes, I've been to the
Budapest.
Workshops, several workshops too.
Gatherings, lots of gatherings.
For me, it is about getting to know a group of people, but also, visit. It's a reason to visit places.
Right.
So I had not been to Novi Sad before, to Serbia before. and I love Budapest. I went there several times in the 90s. I started learning some Hungarian back in the 90s. So that was a good excuse for me to go back there when there was a workshop held, a polyglot workshop held there a year or two after the first conference. And why I was so disappointed I couldn't get to the first conference.
Right.
Aside from actually meeting people for the first time. So the first time I actually met some of the online community was actually at the first polyglot gathering in Berlin, which is another city I love. German is one of my languages, so it was relatively easy for me to get there. Well, I was very nervous about going, Chris. You know, I'm sorry.
I think that's why we met as well for the first time.
Yes. I was nervous about going there because I felt I wasn't really, I'm not I speak 4 or 5 languages well, but I'm not somebody who speaks 10 languages well,
right.
Of which there are quite a few knocking around. Neither am I someone with an obvious gift for languages or a language professional in that sense. So I was worried that it was a bit presumptuous of me to turn up to an event like this. But I needn't have worried, as I say, they are for enthusiasts of all hues. Not everybody's cup of tea, of course, either. So it was important to remember that many wonderful language learners, inspiring language teachers, are not operating in the online community, or they are, but they don't want to attend events. So
that's an interesting
it takes all
there.
types. But we're free agents. Hopefully, we can, we go for what lights our fire, if you like.
Yeah, there's an interesting duality there where the polyglot community is people who learn a lot of languages, basically. So if you're an English teacher, for instance, in England, you're not really attracted to that necessarily. It's kind of a subset. So we can't really merge with the you see the language festival you went to in
yes.
London. What's it called?
That's right, Language Show Live.
Language
yes.
Show. And there were a few. I noticed that Lingualift was there, I think. And
yes.
There are some of the companies that also advertise to actual polyglots, actual multi-learners, or whatever you want to call them. But there seems to be a huge difference, and it just, I barely heard about that conference because it's a trade show, whatever that means. And it's funny.
I think Expo Lingua is a bit like that, isn't it?
Exactly.
I haven't attended that one.
I haven't heard of it. It's funny that we have that.
The Language Show Live, which I attend in London, and I've done a couple of vlogs on now. It's every October. It's a great. It is a trade fair, but it is mainly aimed at the English as a foreign language teaching community and school teachers who are looking for ideas, materials, and wanting to network. Let's say modern language teachers, and also, of course, professionals in translation, interpreting. And new graduates, language graduates who wanted to go into those fields or other fields where languages are used. But it's not so aimed at the sort of person who would want to go to the gathering or the conference, the adult learner of a foreign language.
Right.
Well, there's a lot there for that, but it's not the main focus. It's not the main focus. No.
It's just so interesting because I think if there were anything you could do to improve school learning, I think maybe showing some of the outliers of language learning could be interesting. For instance, if you started French classes with the documentary of Michel Thomas, and then maybe listening to some of the tapes and getting the kids or the young people basically convinced that it's possible, so they shed all their previous misconceptions, or get Richard Simcat out and do a 30-minute presentation.
Yes.
I just think that could work really well together. I'm not trying to say that we need to have everyone be polyglots and we need to have these 12-year-old kids need to understand that they need to learn at least 5 languages because otherwise they'll be useless. No, it's more about, for me at least, to share the joy and the opportunity that is language, whether it's 1 or 20. I think the joy is still there. It's the same. And I think that it's a lot easier than most people think, certainly adults. I mean, a lot of my friends who are not into languages, they don't believe that they can do it at all. And of course, that's the first step then.
But your friends, that would be, I suppose, mates from school in Denmark and so on.
Exactly.
They will all, I imagine, speak quite good English, if not brilliant English.
Right.
So for me, I would have thought if I could speak any language as well as you speak English, Chris, that would be So I would have thought they would have the confidence to think, if I could do it in English, then I can do it in French or Russian or Indonesian. But that isn't the case then in Scandinavian countries.
Not at all. Not at all, because English for us in Denmark, at least, is almost like it's a second native tongue almost. For most people anyway. Like it would be quite strange if somebody said they don't speak any English. So the way that you learn that language is very different to your first school language or your second school language, which I guess would be around the ages of, again, 10, 12, 13. Most people would already know quite a lot of English by then.
And how is that possible? Is that through
it's culture, media, like all the movies and TV shows are subtitled, not dubbed, which is a huge I think actually if there's one thing that's holding language learning back, or general English ability back in countries, it has to be dubbing of everything.
Yes, yeah.
Like
so when you were 6 or 7 or 5, I don't know.
Yeah.
Were you already getting exposure?
Tons.
Because presumably the television for children would have been in Danish at
right.
least. So, but you were also watching films with elder brothers or with your parents, which were English films, or what?
Yeah, or TV or video games. For instance, I was very much into video games, and there were no Danish video games, or if there were, they were terrible. And if you wanted to do well in a video game, you needed to understand it. And so even though we didn't understand many games, we could still play them. But if you saw, let's say, continue or load or these words, if you saw them enough times, eventually you'd figure out what it meant. Or in the case of me, you would have lots of words that you thought meant something and then realized later that they don't mean that at all. But, that was the process. And I think that's the process for most people is, maybe not when they're, infants, so they're watching Cartoon Network, that's of course in Danish, but as soon as they start watching, teenage TV like Friends or what teenagers watch today, I have no idea, Disney Channel, whatever, it will be in English with subtitles, and all movies would be in the original as soon as you're a little bit older. And I honestly don't know if it's changing today, because obviously now there's a lot more technology that maybe makes it easier for people to ignore English because they could just look it up on Google Translate. Like when I was playing video games, we had no way. I mean, we could go get our big fat dictionary and take 30 seconds to look up one word, but we just did it by trial and error. And I think that's caused me to have this kind of pseudo-native tongue of English that you can tell it's not a native, but it's pretty good, pretty high, without actually having done any conscious effort in the learning of it. And so when you ask me, Chris, could you learn French? I would be like, I have no idea how to do that, because English, I didn't do anything. It just kind of happened.
So the experience is so far removed from any subsequent, how you need to learn a subsequent language. And also, I suppose the whole the whole assumptions are that you're going to need English. It's taken as a given. And I noticed this in Germany too, where, of course, it's a much bigger market, so there's far more dubbing, there are loads of video games and so on. It's not comparable with Denmark in some ways. But I noticed that if you look in job adverts for sort of graduate level jobs, it's often, it's English plus another language. That it's just assumed that you will have reached a high standard in English. You don't get any points for that. We have the opposite problem, of course, and that goes back as native English speakers in Britain or in the United States, that the motivation, the social expectation is not there, the economic imperative is not there. Many of us have the experience, and this has been a subject of some of the polyglot events. How do you stop foreigners switching to English? That the whole set of calculations and motivations is very different. So it's just the way it is. There are pluses and minuses. I'm not complaining that English is my mother tongue. It's a wonderful thing, and of course it gives us huge benefits too. But it does mean, just so happens that if you're into trying to speak other languages, then you do have this sort of you have to motivate yourself much more, and you have to be very determined that you're going to use the language if you're in a situation where there are a lot of speakers of English around you, which I suppose is an argument also for picking carefully if you're going to go spend an extended period in another country, where actually you're going to go. That, you may go away from the capital city, for example, or you may want to avoid certain social circles where people want to speak English all the time. So.
Yeah, definitely. But I understand the whole argument, and I've heard from a lot of people. For instance, let's say you're in a class of only English speakers, and you get let's say a Swedish classmate, and you hear him speak Swedish on the phone to his mother, and then casually switches back into English. Just that exposure to that wonderful world of multilingualism, I think, can help a lot of people, and it certainly helped me at some point. But also be happy for the opportunity that you have to. Like most English speakers listening to this will definitely not go jobless anywhere in the world if they're keen on teaching, and a lot of people will just immediately. I know at least in Denmark, if you go to Denmark as a native English speaker, it's hard to speak Danish with Danish people, but they would certainly be very excited to speak English with you, because it's kind of like, it's our culture materialized in a way.
Yes.
So that's
yes.
quite exciting.
Yes, no, and I was lucky. Of course, generally it is a huge advantage for us that we happen to be born with, a language which is so prestigious and so useful throughout the world. It just so happens that, for language learners, it's those who enjoy language learning for its own sake almost, or who really want to, cross the bridge into fluency in another language, then there were always people wanting to speak to you in English. That said, I was lucky on my basket course this summer. There were about 60 of us in the course, several groups. And I was there a month, and there was nobody else who had English as a native language, which was, I think normally there'd be one or two others. So there were a couple from France. Most people's native language, of course, was Spanish. So, and even they were quite self-disciplined most of the time about not flipping into Spanish. But as I don't speak Spanish, I didn't have that option. So I didn't have the problem this time of people trying to speak to me in English, which was great.
Fantastic.
But you don't have that experience, as a teenager, as you say, of you feel that you're shut out of something.
Right.
It's maybe what you're talking about with the video games, that there's a whole world out there of, because of the way, our culture is modulated. It's very much Anglo-American. It's looking towards the United States, to our native music or what have you. And for better or worse, in many ways, that's very insular, very parochial, even if it's on a large scale. But it's how it is, when maybe other countries, as you say, are not much better except for English. So, as you say, in Denmark, would maybe exhibit some of the same characteristics towards other languages.
For sure. Yeah.
All languages.
Actually, that's the point I wanted to make. Is like you were praising Denmark for their multilingualism, but in fact, that just becomes a secondary native language in your head. So when you're thinking about foreign languages, some people might not even consider English, and I think that happens at the language events too. Like, some people don't write English on their badge because, of course, everyone speaks English, which is not an of course. But so my kind of mission, and now that I'm back in Denmark, I think I want to do a bit more work locally, is to get people to understand that English doesn't take you. I mean, you can use it a lot of places, but it doesn't end there. It doesn't have to end there. You can, just because you're going to Spain, you can actually learn Spanish, or you can learn French, so I think English doesn't have the same kind of position in our heads, which is why I don't think that Danish people should get too much credit for their multilingualism, because I think it's a bit like India, where you have tons of native languages and people are so multilingual, but they wouldn't consider themselves, self-taught or polyglots in the same sense, because that's just what you do. That's just the daily life. So I would love to promote that a bit more.
Are you aware of, do you have friends who are trying to learn Danish in Denmark? And it's early days for you, you've just moved back to the country. So, but are you interested in Danish teaching to foreigners, for example, and what's going on in that space? Or
yeah, I'd love to do something there. I'm not a great teacher myself, but I do like to kind of help people, and I think that if I teach somebody for 1 hour, I can obviously help them, but I would prefer to make some kind of, actually look at the materials. Are there any books with less of a vocabulary so they're not as difficult? Are there any tools to help you pronounce it? I hear people all the time, we can't pronounce the language. That's the biggest problem. So I think one of the first things I'll do is I'll record a pronunciation course where I just go through all the sounds, give lots of example sentences, and just have, a camera on my mouth and a camera on my face, so you can really see what's going on. And I think that could help a lot of people. And now that I'm here in Denmark, it seems very like the obvious next step. But
yes, I mean, that's great. And also one could say, okay, well, the market is smaller, the interest is less because it's a smaller language. But of course, on the other hand, there's less provision too. And it's not that small. I mean, there are always going to be people coming to the country needing to learn the language, and you could almost perhaps have more of an impact with a language with fewer speakers.
For sure,
because there are fewer people doing things,
and the materials are probably not as good. So yes, I think I can make a difference both in Danish to foreign and foreign to Danish for sure. And it would be fun to work on that, and also produce maybe materials from other languages that aren't English. So work together with, let's say, Arabic speakers to make really good materials that way, because most people who come to Denmark to stay are not necessarily English speakers. So that would be great. But
have you noticed a change in terms of where you're living now? You've returned to your hometown, I suppose. So are there many refugees around now, or have you noticed a different mix?
No. I mean, this city has always had a fair share of immigrants. And
so where are you then, Chris?
I'm in a small city about an hour from Copenhagen.
Yeah.
It has the beautiful Danish name of Slagelse. yeah, that's good. That's good. And it's a very small one. It's about 40,000 people. But I think a lot of the immigrants or refugees, certainly from Syria, went to Sweden and Germany. So we actually didn't get that many here. But it's a city with lots of multicultural. And before I talked to Richard, I hadn't even thought about learning the language of my fellow citizens here. And now I'm kind of interested in it. I wouldn't say I'm convinced, because I still think it's a huge sacrifice. And it's, like I said, I would almost call Richard a charity polyglot in a way, because he's really choosing to spend his precious time that he could be using to learn languages that he maybe had more personal interest in, to actually help his local community, which I think it's a really great idea. And so who knows, maybe I'll get into some Turkish or Arabic in the next year or so, because I think those are the dominant second languages here in the city.
But of course, those are languages which offer a huge amount in the wider world as well, and with
difficulty
fascinating
too.
cultures behind them. So I think it can be a win-win situation, and I expect that would be how Richard would describe it, actually, that he does very much put emphasis on responsible citizenship, altruism, and giving. But of course, I think he'd also argue that I'm sure you'd agree that you get back then as well,
sure,
many times over, that investment and that contact.
Giving is getting, I've heard before.
Yeah, but it can be difficult to, we can get wrapped up into this. I want to travel, I want to experience new places and so on, particularly when you're younger, you're just leaving home and so on. And that's great, going to see the world if you're lucky enough to be able to do that. But if for other reasons you can't, as you say, that the whole world is at our doorstep, really, locally. if we only just open our eyes and open our ears.
I think my problem is just my list of languages I'd like to learn is just too long, and life is too short. So I'd love to try to fit it in at some point, but I just have so many other languages that I've kind of neglected. For instance, Spanish and French are languages that I wanted to learn forever, basically, and I just never really got around to it until, let's say, 2017, where I'll be trying to learn those two languages. And I just
Spanish and German and French.
No, I speak German already.
Spanish and French.
Yeah, so I'll try to learn them next year, 6 months of each. And I believe a lot in focus. I know some people can learn multiple languages at once, but I just don't. I don't do it very well. I'm a very much an either-or person, and if you're a serial monogamist with your language, so you right,
you don't sleep around, as it were. At least not in the early stages of a relationship.
Right.
Sorry, I'm bringing this conversation back to the straight and narrow, but
never heard.
There's something to be said for focus, isn't it? It's the rocket analogy again, getting off the ground.
Yeah.
You do need a lot of energy, and maybe it is better to focus on French for 6 months and then to move on to the Spanish or the second half.
We'll see. I mean, we'll see what happens. And I think once I have French and Spanish, I think I'll be quite content with my portfolio. I've got English, Danish, German, Russian, Hungarian, French, and Spanish. I think that's a very wide spread.
Yes.
Not pretending to speak any of them well, but I can work on that later instead of.
Well, that's it. It's a lifetime's commitment as well. I'm an illustration of that, if anybody is, because I got to reasonable upper intermediate levels 20 years ago with Russian and German, and I'm coming back to them now. I went, but when I trained as a lawyer, I then worked in the from 2004 to 2008-9 in Moscow, an international law firm. So again, I was using my Russian again. I've returned to Germany on secondments back, and then on visits to see friends there. You build up a network, you build up a bit of a life in the language. And that, if you build it in very carefully to your life in terms of your interests or relationships, where you take your holidays, over the years, then you do have a lot of time too. That once you've got to the basic conversational level, then you can maintain that, but then you can also take it further as and when you want to do, and that's a process that never ends.
Right, and that's my entire ambition as well, is to make this portfolio of maybe 10 languages, and of course not limiting myself if it comes to that, but getting to these 10 languages to a good level in the next couple of years, and then I'll just be spending the next the rest of my life just improving them as it comes, and dabbling in new fun languages and see what happens. I think that is, motivation-wise, it's very helpful to see a language learning as a journey that continues, and it's not just a 3-month project or a 6-month project. Or, I mean, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not saying anything about that, but for me, language learning is certainly a long-term thing, and I don't have any deadlines per se, but obviously you have to remember also to do some stuff once in a while. Sometimes it can get a little bit too casual.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've had a lot of fun, but unfortunately everything must come to an end. And thanks so much, Gareth, for sharing your story and your passion and your tips and tricks for learning languages. I'm glad that we could find the time to sit down and talk about it.
Well, thank you, Chris Tack. It was great finally to be on the show. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Actual Fluency Podcast.